Welcome to the deep dive. In today's world, the digital realm isn't really this separate thing anymore, is it?
Not at all. It's deeply, deeply woven into, well, everything else. Physical borders, politics, economics.
Exactly. Geopolitical tensions, they aren't just lines on a map we see on the news. They're actively reshaping the digital landscape that, well, all of us operate in.
And it impacts everything from, say, global trade and tech components, right down to the security of your personal information.
That connection feels clearer than ever. What happens between nations in conflicts, it has these immediate real effects in cyberspace.
And vice versa, absolutely. The cyber domain influences geopolitical events, too.
So today we're taking a deep dive into a whole collection of sources that are exploring this really complex intersection.
Yeah, we're digging into things like national data laws, how cybersecurity plays out during conflict.
The kind of unexpected cyber impacts of trade wars, which is fascinating.
And that bigger picture concept.
Yeah.
Digital sovereignty.
Right. And our mission today is really to unpack what all this means for you and for organizations trying to navigate this, well, let's face it, increasingly volatile environment.
And the insights we're discussing, they come from a range of articles, research papers. We're looking closely at China's data laws, for example, how cyber thinking becomes critical during conflicts, the challenges in getting global players to cooperate.
And some really interesting analyses of how trade wars and this idea of data localization connect directly back to national security.
Yeah, it's all connected.
Okay, so let's kick things off with maybe a foundational idea here that underpins a lot of this. Data sovereignty. What are the sources telling us that is?
Well, data sovereignty, it really stems from the older principle of state sovereignty.
Okay, like a country's authority over its own territory.
Precisely. A state's authority within its borders, free from outside interference. So when you apply that concept to the digital world, data sovereignty basically means that any data generated or even just stored within a specific geographic location, well, it's subject to that place's laws and regulations.
So wait, if I store data, say, physically located in country X, even if my company's based somewhere else entirely, that data is bound by country X's rules.
That's the core idea. It gives that territorial state legal control, essentially, over data within its physical borders.
Okay, now here's where it gets, I think, really interesting. Why is data sovereignty suddenly such a massive focus, especially for countries like China? What's driving this push, according to the sources?
Well, there are several really critical drivers. A primary one is definitely national security and control.
Okay.
China, for example, sees data sovereignty as absolutely essential for protecting sensitive national information, guarding against foreign espionage, cyber attacks, outside influence.
Right.
And it also supports internal state objectives, things like surveillance, managing information flows that they see as necessary for, well, social stability.
So it's kind of defensive against external threats, but also a tool for internal governance. Is that fair?
That's a very good way to put it, yeah. And beyond that, there's also the stated goal of protecting the personal data of their own residents.
Okay.
The idea is to ensure personal info is handled according to their national standards. Though it's important to remember, this happens within the framework the government itself defines.
And there's a big economic piece, too, isn't there? A technological independence angle.
Oh, absolutely huge. Data is viewed as a critical national asset for the digital economy. So, mandating data localization, making companies store and process data locally, that helps boost domestic tech companies.
Right. Keeps the business inside.
Exactly. It's a strategy to capture and keep the economic benefits of all that data-driven growth within the nation's borders, and it helps foster technological independence over time.
And for foreign companies trying to operate in China, it sounds like a pretty direct way to regulate them.
It is, yeah. Data sovereignty gives them a clear legal hook to enforce local laws like those data localization rules or government access mandates on foreign firms operating there. It prevents them from easily sidestepping domestic oversight.
That makes a lot of sense. The sources, they mention China's approach is sometimes called the Beijing effect, right? And they contrast it with the EU's Brussels effect from GDPR.
Yeah, they represent pretty distinct models for how you assert digital governance and influence globally.
And China's framework, it seems particularly complex, built on these three major laws that, well, any organization dealing with Chinese data really needs to understand.
That's right. You've got three pillars, essentially.
Okay, let's unpack those. First up, the cybersecurity law, the CSL, from back in 2017. What was the main thrust of that law? What were its key parts?
So the CSL, that was really the foundational piece, a broad framework for regulating cyberspace, network security, and it put a special focus on what they call critical information infrastructure operators, or CIIOs.
Okay, CIIOs. Critical infrastructure.
Right. And a key requirement it introduced was data localization specifically for these CIIOs. It mandated that personal information and data deemed important that they collect or generate within China. Well, it had to be stored domestically.
Keep the important stuff local.
By default, yeah. And if you wanted to transfer it cross-border, you needed to go through a security assessment and get government approval.
So a hurdle to moving data out. What about just general network security?
Well, I put significant responsibility on all network operators, really, to monitor their systems, implement safeguards, report security incidents. It also had provisions on protecting personal info, like needing user consent for collection.
And the government's access under CSO, how much power did it give them?
It granted pretty extensive authority for government access and control, national security agencies, law enforcement. They could compel technical support from network operators, and it reinforced requirements around content monitoring and, well, censorship.
What kind of teeth did this law have? Were there real penalties?
Oh, yeah. The penalties were designed to be significant. Organizations could face substantial fines, they could have their operations suspended, licenses revoked.
Wow.
And individuals deemed responsible could face personal liability, even potentially criminal prosecution in really severe cases.
Okay, so CSL laid the groundwork. Then fast forward to 2021, and we get the data security law, the DSL. How did that build on or expand the framework?
The DSL, yeah, it provided a much more comprehensive system for handling data across the board, not just for that critical infrastructure. A really key aspect is its data classification system.
Okay, classifying data.
Exactly. It categorizes data based on its importance to national security, public interest, economic development, and then applies stricter controls and higher levels of protection to data that gets classified as important or core.
So the type of data and how sensitive it is became much more central.
Precisely. It also reinforced the government's access rights to data for purposes like, national security, maintaining public order, economic management. And like the CSL, it reiterated those data localization and cross-border transfer requirements, especially for that critical or important data.
But the sources also mentioned it tried to balance security with sort of encouraging data use.
That's right. Within this quite strict regulatory structure, the DSL does encourage the productive use of data. The idea is to foster innovation and economic growth, recognizing that data is a vital economic resource, but always within their rules.
And then finally, the third pillar, also from 2021, is the Personal Information Protection Law, or PIPL, which sounds like China's version of GDPR.
That's a very common comparison, yeah. PIPL is China's first dedicated law focusing solely on safeguarding the personal information of individuals residing in China. It kicked in November 2021.
And its main goal is giving people more control over their data.
Primarily, yes, giving individuals rights over their personal information.
Now, one really critical point the sources highlight about PIPL is its reach, isn't it? Its scope.
It is. That's probably one of the most significant aspects. PIPL has extraterritorial scope. Meaning, it applies to any organization anywhere in the world that processes the personal data of Chinese residents. It doesn't matter if your company has a physical presence in China or not. If you handle data belonging to someone living in China, PIPL applies to you.
Wow. Okay, that is a very broad net. So what are the key obligations for companies under PIPL then?
Well, organizations have to grant Chinese residents significant rights over their data. Things like the right to access it, correct it, delete it, object to how it's processed, even request data portability, similar to GDPR.
Okay.
And a key principle, again, much like GDPR, is establishing a legal basis for processing data with a very strong emphasis on informed consent.
Consent again.
Yes, and it has to be specific, explicit, freely given consent. And crucially, users have the right to withdraw that consent at any time.
So very clear requirements there. What are the responsibilities for the companies, the data processors themselves?
They have pretty strict obligations too. Data minimization is key. Only collect what's absolutely necessary for a specific purpose. Process data only for stated legitimate purposes. Implement robust security measures, both technical and organizational. Yeah. And they need to conduct regular security assessments or audits. And for organizations that handle large volumes of personal data or do complex processing, appointing a data protection officer, a DPO, is mandatory.
Okay. And getting data out of China. under PIPL, cross-border transfers.
That's one of the most stringent areas still. Transferring personal data out of China requires meeting specific conditions. Often that involves undergoing government security assessments and getting approval.
So more hurdles.
Definitely. There are alternative mechanisms being developed, like government-approved standard contractual clauses or getting certifications, but it remains a complex and often burdensome process.
And if you violate PIPL, what are the penalties?
They are severe, potentially very severe. Fines can go up to 50 million RMB, which is roughly, 7.7 million US dollars? Or, and this is the kicker, up to 5% of the entity's global annual revenue from the previous year.
5% of global revenue. Wow.
Yeah. Plus, individuals who are directly responsible can face personal fines, they can be blacklisted, and violations can be publicly disclosed, which is obviously a huge reputational hit.
So with these three laws, CSL, DSL, PIPL, who exactly needs to worry about compliance? Who falls under this umbrella?
It's a very, very wide net. Obviously, domestic Chinese companies, but also foreign companies operating within China, multinationals, financial firms, cloud providers, you name it.
Okay.
Then you have the CIOs in critical sectors, telecoms, energy, finance, transport, healthcare. Also, third-party service providers who handle Chinese data, even if they're outside China, IT vendors, consultants, and even government and public institutions within China itself.
Yeah.
Pretty much anyone touching data related to China or its residents.
Okay, so summing up the requirements across this whole framework, it prioritizes local storage, especially for certain types of data.
Right, though there have been some recent nuances there.
It mandates compliance with Chinese national standards, allows for government access for security or regulatory reasons, enforces principles like data minimization and purpose limitation, and requires explicit user consent, especially for personal data under PIPL.
This is a pretty good summary, yeah. And while, as you alluded to, there have been some recent adjustments, maybe trying to ease some cross-border transfers for regular business activities for multinationals, the core principle remains asserting Chinese jurisdiction and control over data related to its territory and its residents. And the drivers are still primarily national security and economic goals.
Okay. Now let's try and connect these really complex data laws to that broader and, frankly, quite unsettling picture of rising geopolitical tensions and actual conflicts. The sources really hammer home how the cyber realm has become a primary battlefield in this new era.
It absolutely has. And that reality fundamentally changes roles within organizations, especially for the Chief Information Security Officer, the CISO.
How so?
Well, in times of geopolitical conflict, the CISO's job, their mandate, it expands way beyond just traditional technical defenses. They really become strategic leaders.
Strategic leaders.
Yeah. They're managing crisis response, figuring out how to ensure the business can actually keep operating under pressure, securing vulnerable supply chains, vetting vendors much more rigorously, protecting critical communications, coordinating constantly with internal teams, but also with government agencies, international partners. It's a much broader, more strategic role.
So they're not just, guarding the firewall anymore. They're integral to the organization's actual resilience and survival when things get tough.
Exactly. And another point the sources bring up, which is maybe often overlooked but crucial, is workforce resilience. Meaning ensuring employees are trained for these high-stress scenarios, understanding the threats, but also supporting their well-being. Because people under extreme stress make mistakes.
Right. And the threat landscape itself, that must transform dramatically in conflict.
Oh, completely. Geopolitical conflict brings state-sponsored attacks right to the forefront. Things like espionage, targeting critical infrastructure, power grids, financial systems. That becomes much more likely, much more prevalent. And the sources point out an interesting dynamic. Economic sanctions, paradoxically, can actually incentivize the sanctioned nations to develop offensive cyber capabilities.
How does that work?
Well, it might be to bypass restrictions, maybe retaliate, or even, as some sources suggest with North Korea, for example, potentially using cyber operations, sometimes through groups like Lazarus, for financial gain. Think WannaCry or attacks targeting the SWIFT banking system. It becomes a tool.
And the sort of rules of engagement, if there ever were any, they seem to shift too.
They absolutely do. Motivations change. It might be less about pure financial gain and more about strategic goals. espionage, sabotage, disrupting an adversary's economy, or even psychological warfare.
Okay.
And you see financially motivated cyber criminals, just regular criminals, opportunistically exploiting the chaos. Plus, hacktivist groups often pop up.
Right, the hacktivists.
Yeah, and sometimes they're actually operating as fronts for nation states, like the Russia-aligned Killnet group was mentioned. It just complicates attribution and figuring out who's doing what.
Are there specific examples from the sources that kind of illustrate this shift in attacks?
Yes, definitely. The sources point to the persistent cyber campaigns targeting Ukraine, starting way back in 2014 as a really clear example. That involved web defacements, malware, sophisticated disinformation ops. Another example highlighted was the Volt Typhoon activity, which showed sustained targeting of critical infrastructure, including in the U.S., reportedly by a state-sponsored actor. It just underscores this need to anticipate that adversaries will fundamentally shift their behavior and targets in conflict.
It sounds like the human element, you mentioned workforce resilience, becomes even more vulnerable when tensions are high.
Unquestionably, yeah. Stress, confusion, fear. During a conflict or under attack, that significantly increases the likelihood of human error. Clicking on the wrong link, falling for a scam.
Right.
And disinformation campaigns, social engineering, they are designed specifically to exploit that turmoil, to manipulate employees into making security mistakes or even spreading false narratives.
What about those really sophisticated attackers, the advanced persistent threats, the APTs? Does their activity ramp up too?
The sources indicate, yes, the intensity and frequency of APT activity increase significantly in conflict scenarios. These are those long-term, highly sophisticated operations, often backed by nation-states.
Right, the spies.
Essentially, yeah. Focused on long-term intelligence gathering or disruption. And their tactics are advanced, complex social engineering, custom malware, exploiting 0 days.
And do their targets change? Maybe things that were off limits before?
That's a real concern raised. As cyber conflicts escalate, those traditional rules or maybe just norms of behavior for APTs, they can blur. They might start collaborating with cybercrime groups or potentially target sectors previously seen as somewhat off limits because of the risk of escalation or condemnation, like healthcare organizations or civilian critical infrastructure that directly impacts people's lives.
Oh. Do the sort of regular cyber criminals change their behavior too?
They might adapt, yeah. While they're often still focused on money, criminals can definitely exploit the confusion of conflict. They might see opportunity in the disruption, maybe targeting sectors they previously avoided because security was tighter or the payoff wasn't clear. And sometimes their motives, while mainly financial, can become politically aligned, maybe acting in tacit support of a state actor.
And hacktivism. We touched on it, but does it become more prevalent?
Far more common, yes. And the frequency and the scale of the activity can increase dramatically during conflicts. Groups like Killnet or various groups seen active during the Israel-Hamas conflict, they really exemplify this. And the tricky part is sometimes nation-states use these groups as a cover, right? Plausible deniability for their own operations.
And disinformation, you mentioned? It's clearly a massive weapon in this whole landscape.
Oh, huge. It escalates dramatically during political conflicts and military operations. The sources point vividly to Russia's war against Ukraine as a prime example.
How does that impact companies specifically?
Well, these disinformation campaigns can have a direct impact on a company's operations. They can influence employee decisions, damage the company's reputation, even cause people inside the company to act based on false information.
So it's not just an IT problem.
Not at all. Addressing it requires moving way beyond traditional IT security. You need increased employee awareness training. You probably need advanced analytics to even spot these campaigns, robust incident response plans that specifically account for information warfare, and really deeply integrating cyber threat intelligence into your day-to-day security operations.
So this cyber battlefield, it directly connects to the physical world of business, supply chains, even something that seems maybe distant, like trade wars.
It absolutely does. It's all interconnected. Geopolitical conflicts, they cause massive disruption to both physical and digital supply chains.
How so?
Think about logistics, delivery times, the actual availability of critical components like chips, vendor reliability. It all gets thrown into chaos. And this forces organizations to urgently reevaluate who they depend on and scramble to find alternative sourcing strategies.
And the rise of trade barriers, we're seeing sanctions, restrictions, tariffs that demands rapid adjustments for businesses too.
It certainly does. Things that might have been just good practice before, like strategic stockpiling of key components or really diversifying your supplier base, they become absolute necessities for survival.
And this is where, as the sources really emphasize, geopolitics directly creates cybersecurity risks for organizations. They use the example of recent U.S. tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, China.
Yeah, that's a great example they unpacked.
How do tariffs on, say, steel or aluminum become a cybersecurity issue? That connection isn't immediately obvious to me.
It's a really critical link the sources draw out. So when tariffs are imposed, let's say that 25% tariff on certain imports, they often trigger retaliation.
Right. Tit for tat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Canada imposed reciprocal tariffs. China responded with tariffs on U.S. agriculture, but also, crucially, expanded export restrictions on critical technology components and even specific cybersecurity-related industries.
Okay, so that means higher costs and restrictions on actually getting the technology components you need. What are the cybersecurity implications of that?
Well, first, it directly impacts the cost and the security of your IT supply chains. It makes it harder and more expensive to get necessary cybersecurity tools. But perhaps most concerning, these trade disputes can escalate beyond just economics. They can lead to retaliatory cyber attacks targeting sectors or companies tied to the tariffs.
And what if a company suddenly has to find a new supplier for, say, network hardware, because their usual one is hit by tariffs?
That's a major risk area the sources flagged. Companies scrambling to find alternative suppliers super quickly to avoid those tariff costs. They might bypass essential security due diligence. They just need the part.
Right, speed over security.
Which significantly increases the risk of accidentally procuring counterfeit hardware or components that might have hidden backdoors or embedded malware. It can also lead to organizations delaying their regular refresh cycles on critical security gear, firewalls, servers, because the cost has suddenly shot up. And that leaves them running older, less secure systems for longer.
So tariffs could actually force companies into making less secure choices just to manage the budget fallout.
Precisely. And the sources also point out China's significant dominance in supplying things like rare earth minerals.
For semiconductors?
Exactly. Essential for semiconductors, networking equipment, even encryption hardware. So any export controls from China on those minerals could severely impact the global availability and the cost of next-generation cybersecurity technology for everyone.
Does the sort of underlying economic tension from tariffs also make cyber attacks more likely in general?
Yes, that's another key point. Tariffs definitely increase economic tensions between the countries involved, and this can lead to a direct rise in cyber espionage and disruptive attacks between those nations. The U.S. versus China relationship is often cited as a prime example here.
Okay.
Furthermore, the economic strain that tariffs put on businesses themselves can lead to internal budget cuts. That might mean smaller security teams, less investment in cybersecurity tools and training, which obviously increases risk. And the sources also note that economic hardship within companies can increase the risk of insider threats. You know, a disgruntled employee might be more susceptible to being recruited by a nation-state for espionage or sabotage if they're feeling financial pressure.
That's a really challenging cascade of effects. How else do tariffs impact the actual market for cybersecurity tools and vendors?
Well, beyond just the hardware components, you're seeing export restrictions tightening on specific cybersecurity tools and software, too. The U.S., for instance, has placed new restrictions on exporting things like intrusion software, certain surveillance tools, AI-driven security tech.
So it could be harder to even develop or acquire advanced security capabilities.
It can be, yeah. Things like penetration testing tools, red teaming software, even some AI-powered threat detection systems could face new licensing hurdles or export restrictions depending on where they're going or where they originated. This inevitably slows down the sharing of threat intelligence, even between allies, and contributes to this fragmentation of cybersecurity standards and technologies globally. It can hinder innovation, especially in cutting-edge areas like AI-driven security.
And the cost implications for security products themselves.
Well, tariffs directly drive up prices for essential security, hardware firewalls, intrusion detection systems, secure gateways. This can delay product launches for vendors, and it makes it more expensive for organizations like yours to upgrade defenses.
Right.
Increased costs for cloud security services, often because the underlying infrastructure faces tariffs. That can also trickle down to businesses as higher subscription fees. The sources mention specific impacts like Canadian firms facing a double whammy of U.S. tariffs, the strong U.S. dollar, and then additional Canadian surtaxes on U.S. goods.
How are security vendors trying to deal with this? What are their strategies?
Well, some are trying to be strategic, maybe shifting towards more software-based solutions where possible to avoid hardware tariffs. They're exploring supply chain partnerships in regions not affected by the tariffs, and they're having to constantly monitor for retaliatory measures that could suddenly impact their international sales or distribution.
And for sectors maybe with tighter budgets, like the public sector or small businesses, how does this hit them?
Yeah, this is where the impact can be particularly acute. Higher costs for hardware and software due to tariffs that directly increases their operational expenses. It forces really tough budget decisions.
Meaning security might lose out.
Potentially, yeah. It could lead to them being significantly underprotected compared to larger enterprises with deeper pockets. Limited access to essential security technology due to cost or restrictions just increases their overall risk exposure.
And finally, how does cyber insurance fit into this picture? Does it get more complicated?
It does. Cyber insurance, it relies heavily on risk modeling, understanding the threat landscape, and evaluating the policyholder's security controls.
Yeah.
So the increased risk exposure caused by tariffs, making organizations potentially less protected because of cost barriers or delayed upgrades that can lead insurers to potentially raise premiums or impose stricter underwriting requirements, they see the risk going up.
Makes sense.
And additionally, if a breach does occur, delays in acquiring essential forensic tools or incident response services because of tariffs or restrictions, that can hinder mitigation efforts, making the breach worse and ultimately increasing the claim costs for the insurers. And those higher costs eventually feed back into higher premiums for everyone.
So this whole tangled web, geopolitics, data laws, cyber conflict, trade, it creates just massive challenges for, everyone. What are some of the biggest global challenges the sources highlighted?
Well, a major one is just the difficulty of global collaboration against cyber threats. National laws, as we've discussed, they vary wildly. Some are incredibly strict, others are almost non-existent. That makes it incredibly hard to standardize policies or coordinate unified responses.
Yeah, trust.
Huge issue. Trust issues between countries, which are obviously deeply exacerbated by geopolitical tensions, severely hinder the sharing of sensitive threat intelligence. And that intelligence sharing is absolutely crucial for any kind of collective defense.
And you mentioned resource gaps.
Yes, significant gaps exist between, say, developed and developing nations in terms of cybersecurity capacity. This leaves some regions much more exposed to sophisticated state-sponsored attacks or large-scale criminal campaigns.
Okay.
Plus, you run into tricky legal and ethical dilemmas. What might be standard international cyber cooperation in peacetime can become highly contentious or even illegal during conflict. Think about sanction regimes. They create complex legal problems for companies just trying to respond to an incident if it involves entities from a sanctioned nation.
Let's circle back for a moment to data localization, where we kind of started. The sources talked about a sort of data localization paradox, especially when you look at it from a national security angle.
They do. It's a really interesting tension. There's definitely a clear argument for data localization from a national security perspective.
Which is?
Well, the sources note it can be seen as a way to prevent hostile regimes from accessing sensitive data. Think about South Korea's concerns about North Korea, or U.S. and Indian concerns about data access by Chinese entities or the CCP. It's also intended to give legitimate law enforcement easier access for criminal investigations within their own borders and restrict the activities of malign actors operating there.
Okay, that's the pro argument. But
Right.
the sources also present a strong counter-argument, right? That data localization itself can actually undermine security and collaboration.
Absolutely, and that's the paradox. Data localization, while often framed as being about protection, can also be used as a tool of digital authoritarianism.
How so?
By territorializing data, putting it squarely under government jurisdiction, it can be used to limit democracy and human rights through increased surveillance and censorship. Often this is done under the guise of national security or protecting citizens. And the sources point out that sometimes the definitions of what counts as critical or important data are deliberately kept subjective or overly broad, which significantly expands state control.
And how does it hinder international security cooperation? You mentioned intelligence sharing earlier.
It creates significant obstacles, yeah. When data is locked within national borders, it makes it much harder for military, law enforcement, and intelligence agencies to collaborate across those borders. Accessing information needed for global threat intelligence sharing, transnational criminal investigations, coordinated responses against global cyber threats.
Yeah.
it all becomes much more difficult.
Yep.
It can also inadvertently provide safe havens for gray zone actors or cyber criminals who operate on platforms or services that are subject to strict localization requirements in certain countries. And this whole issue is often made worse by outdated international legal frameworks like mutual legal assistance treaties or MLATs, which are notoriously slow and just not suited for the speed of cyber investigations.
And for companies themselves, it sounds like it just adds layers of cybersecurity risk and operational complexity.
It definitely does. Implementing data localization often means organizations have to build and maintain more physical data centers in more locations. Each new data center is another potential attack surface. You've got physical security risks, hardware and software vulnerabilities in that specific location, and the need to staff and secure personnel locally, which introduces human risks like phishing campaigns tailored to that region. Organizations end up managing these incredibly complex technical systems just to balance data loads and ensure compliance across potentially inconsistent regulations in different countries. And as any engineer will tell you, more complexity often means more vulnerabilities and a less secure overall system.
So, okay, given all these intertwined challenges, the laws, the conflicts, the trade wars, these paradoxes, what strategies do the sources suggest organizations should actually adopt to try and navigate this fragmented world?
Well, it really requires a multi-layered, proactive approach. The sources really emphasize taking proactive measures before a potential conflict or major disruption escalates.
Like what?
Like assessing honestly whether your organization could be a target, why, and by whom. Thoroughly mapping out your critical assets and understanding your potential vulnerabilities. Conducting regular, realistic employee security training and simulations based on current threats. Reinforcing your technical defenses, obviously, and maybe even disabling non-essential or particularly risky assets that could serve as easy entry points for attackers.
Okay, that's before things get really bad. What if conflict seems imminent?
Then it's about rapid strategic adjustments. Making absolutely sure your business continuity and disaster recovery plans are up to date and crucially tested. Simulating major supply chain disruptions and practicing how you would switch suppliers quickly. Preparing for that likely increase in hacktivism by verifying the integrity of your public-facing digital infrastructure and having capabilities ready to detect adversaries early. Updating your infrastructure, processes, playbooks. That might even involve things like temporarily isolating certain critical systems or pausing automatic software updates if there's a risk they could be compromised upstream. And critically, creating distributed or, even better, offline backups of essential data, and increasing your power and internet redundancy, especially in regions that might be directly affected.
And for the longer term, what sustained strategies are needed just to operate in this environment ongoing?
This is really about continuous adaptation. Organizations have to constantly monitor the geopolitical landscape and relevant threat intelligence to adapt their operations and supply chains, sometimes in real time. Regularly reassess your risk posture based on what's happening and adjust your security strategies accordingly.
Stay flexible.
Extremely flexible. Be prepared to adapt to rapidly changing regulatory and policy environments, new trade restrictions, sudden sanctions, shifts in data localization rules. And finally, keep future-proofing your security capabilities. Investing in advanced threat detection, strong encryption, robust backup, and disaster recovery. And fortifying alliances is key here too, actively participating in intelligence sharing networks with industry peers, government agencies, international partners. You can't go it alone.
It sounds like the traditional way of thinking about cybersecurity risk, the risk model itself, needs a pretty significant update too.
It absolutely does. Organizations need to really internalize that their attack surface has expanded dramatically. It's not just the traditional network perimeter anymore.
Right.
It includes all the IoT devices you have, your vast cloud footprint, your remote work environments, any emergency access granted to maybe untrusted devices during a crisis, even potential physical limitations, power outages, connectivity issues, and conflict zones. Risk models have to be dynamic, regularly reassessed based on real-time threat intel and a much deeper understanding of geopolitical developments and sector-specific risks.
And third-party and vendor management. You mentioned supply chains. That becomes even more critical.
Exponentially more critical, yes. Organizations really need to reassess their third-party risk management TPRM frameworks, probably require much stricter security audits for any new suppliers, especially those based in or sourcing from potentially volatile regions. Verifying the authenticity of components becomes crucial. Are you getting what you think you're getting? And the sources strongly advise diversifying your procurement sources before you're forced to do so by tariffs or conflict. build those relationships, and conduct the security vetting proactively. Security really needs to become a core function integrated right into procurement decisions, vetting vendor hygiene, enforcing security standards contractually, and elevating due diligence processes, especially during M&A or international expansion.
What about specific technical measures that can help shore things up?
Well, the fundamentals are still fundamental. Implementing strong encryption for data, both at rest and in transit, is absolutely basic. Robust access controls, continuous monitoring, non-negotiables. Leveraging AI-powered detection and response systems can help cope with the speed and volume of modern attacks.
Okay.
Securing data specifically stored in the cloud requires targeted strategies like data security posture management or DSPM. And increasingly, organizations are looking towards more platformized security solutions, trying to get unified threat intelligence and response capabilities across their entire complex environment.
And having a plan for when things do go wrong, incident response.
Essential. You need robust incident response plans. You need the capability for quick detection, effective response, and rapid recovery. And you absolutely must conduct regular drills and simulations, realistic ones, to ensure the plan actually works under pressure and that personnel know exactly what their roles are.
Collaboration felt like a theme running through a lot of this discussion.
It's critical, yeah. It's maybe the most critical element for resilience in this fragmented world. Actively engaging in cross-border intelligence sharing with peers, participating in joint response exercises, even advocating for more coordinated regulatory approaches where possible, it's all vital. Participating in those intelligence sharing networks, ISACs, ISOs, between public and private sectors, with government agencies, industry groups, that's crucial for gaining the necessary situational awareness to even know what threats you're facing.
And ultimately, this isn't just a technical problem for the IT department or the CISO to solve alone.
No, absolutely not. The sources are very clear on this. Building resilience against these complex, geopolitically driven cyber threats is not solely the CISO's responsibility. It requires active C-suite and board-level involvement. It requires shared accountability across the entire organization.
Right.
The goal isn't just achieving...
What are some of those big questions they're wrestling with?
Well, fundamental questions like, in a world with such uneven data governance rules, increasing state surveillance, and the splintering of the digital space, will people ultimately lose trust in the internet itself or in global digital services? Can that trust be maintained? Another big one is how the United States will strategically engage in this shifting digital landscape. Will it take a leading role in shaping norms or risk kind of remaining on the sidelines as other major powers like the EU with its regulatory influence that Brussels effect and China with its state-centric model, the Beijing effect, actively compete to shape the future of digital governance?
And that paradox we talked about earlier, data localization.
Yes, exactly. How do we find a way to resolve that fundamental paradox where the very fears driving national data localization efforts, the legitimate desire to protect data from rivals or hostile actors, also provide the justification for more digital fragmentation globally? Fragmentation that, ironically, might end up making everyone less secure and less able to collaborate against shared threats.
That certainly leaves us, and you listening, with a lot to ponder. Here's a final thought. In this era where digital fragmentation seems increasingly driven by national security anxieties and fierce economic competition, how can we, collectively, ensure that this pursuit of data sovereignty by individual nations doesn't ultimately undermine the very things it often claims to protect: security, privacy, innovation, and crucially, the potential for global collaboration against the truly shared digital threats we all face?
That is a critical question, I think, for policymakers, for technologists, and really for every organization trying to navigate this complex digital world going forward.